for a variety of reasons, and we'll see what's going on there. But I think it's worth just saying in the big picture that we all know that Jacob has not been the best of characters in God's word up until this point. His name does mean the deceiver, and I think that fits pretty good. And if you remember, he fled home because he had deceived his brother Esau and stolen the birthright and all those things. So, he fled sort of as a man on the lam. He's done a few things there and multiplied wives and been, I think, outside of the will of God on a number of reasons. But now he's heading home. And in the big picture, what we've seen is that despite himself in many ways, God has looked after him and has blessed him because he's a descendant of the promise. He's in Abraham's line, whether he deserves that or not. And so, and I think in that way, it's probably a reminder of all of our stories. God has shown us grace whether we deserve it or not. And he bestows good things upon his children. In many cases, things we do not deserve. Again, I've said it many times. We don't want what we deserve. We'll take all the grace and all the mercy he'll give us, and he does. And we're going to see that in Jacob's journey. And there's even a little revival orchestrated here, I believe, in the midst of some drama. And I think it's all being done to remind Jacob, you're not just going home, but you're going home to the land of your father, the land of your God. You're going back to where God made some significant promises to him and to his family, and we'll see all that. But we just kind of jump in. We start with the confrontation here, the way this pursuit plays out. I hope I've said enough to kind of reestablish the stage, but Laban overtook Jacob. Now, Jacob had pitched his tents in the hill country, and Laban with his kinsmen pitched tents in the hill country of Gilead. That's obviously much closer to home than where he's been, and so we know he's getting closer. But this phrase, pitch their tents, or pitch tents, is really, it's typically a military term. And I think the implication is supposed to be that Laban's group is armed and dangerous, and they're preparing to confront or invade or detain Jacob in some way. And I suspect Jacob is sweating bullets at this point. Because in general, I'm sure he has a few servants traveling with him, but he has a group of women and children, and he has a bunch of sheep, that used to belong to Laban. He didn't steal them, but he kind of finagled them. We remember all that, and so that's what he's returning home with. Now, understand the way we left things were, I think Jacob had good reason not to trust Laban, but that we saw God certainly did not tell him to slip out under the cover of darkness. God told him to go home, but he didn't tell him to pull this fast one and load everybody up without communicating to his extended family and just head off to head off home. And so I don't think Jacob fully trusted God. I think his deceitful nature had a lot to do with the way he exited. And so this confrontation that's about to occur, I don't think it's because of anything God's done in Jacob's life. I think it's because of the way Jacob has handled himself. I think he probably should have been up front with his father-in-law and told him that God sent him home, that he was going to leave with all of his children and his wives, and that includes Laban's daughters, of course, and should have made peace with him. But he didn't do that. He is deceitful, and so that brings us to where we are. Kind of the heart of the text. We see Laban's complaints. There's a confrontation here. Laban shows up with his men. He said to Jacob, "What have you done that you've tricked me and driven away my daughters like captives of the sword?" And I think, again, there's a lot to criticize about Laban in this text, but I think we can at least see his perspective, that it feels like that. It would have been customary for there to be at least communicate, before you load up and leave. Why did you flee secretly and trick me and did not tell me, so that I might have sent you away with mirth and songs, with tambourine and lyre? And then it goes on, and why did you not permit me to kiss my sons and my daughters farewell? Now you have done foolishly. And so right from the beginning, I would argue we see both the wicked and strategic nature of Laban here. He's going to seize that moral high ground as quickly as he can. He wants to get Jacob backpedaling. And if you've forgotten, he was really trying to fleece Jacob for all he could. He manipulated things from the very beginning. Laban's not a good dude, but I think we can also agree that he probably should have been given the right to kiss his daughters and his grandchildren goodbye. I don't think any of us would like to be treated that way. So all that's happening, and we've got to know this is all happening in front of the two encampments. Everybody involved is probably hearing this conversation. All the hired men, all the servants, all the women. And Laban has some points to make. I suspect when he mentions, you've driven them off, he says like captives of the sword. He's probably holding a sword, or he's got his hand on the hilt of his sword. I think there's an implication that there's a conflict ready to happen. There's an undercurrent of confrontation, if the potential for a brawl, you could say. I think if you're not reading this, understanding that you could cut the tension with a knife, you're missing that. So let's make sure we understand that. But let's consider the nature of his complaints here. The trick, it's kind of at the heart of this. His first complaint is really how Jacob fled the town. He does imply that Laban's daughters, he took them away like captives of the sword. But I know it's been a while, but if you've been with us, anybody remember when Jacob went to his two wives and said, hey, what do you think about how your daddy's been handling things and treating us? And they pretty much said, we're tools in the hands of our father. He's just worried about what he can get for us. And so I don't really think Jacob, he didn't manipulate his wives. He didn't drive them out by the fear of the sword. He communicated with them, and they were ready to go because they felt like pawns in the hands of their father. And so let's be honest about that. They willfully joined Jacob in this exodus. And like we pointed out, they rarely agreed on anything. So it had to be significant that they both turned on their father, so to speak. But that's not all that Laban is angry about. He's mad that they fled in secrecy, prevented him from a royal send-off, which again, in general, would have been customary in their culture. If you flash way back to Genesis 24, they did that when Rebekah departed to go marry Isaac. But it's hard to believe Laban's bluster here. And if you remember, before we left off in the fall, God actually came to him and warned him how to handle this confrontation. Back in chapter 20, or verse 24, God came to Laban the Aramean in a dream by night and said to him, be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. And I would argue that in the original language, it also implies don't do anything to Jacob, okay? Be very careful what you say and what you do. Now, as far as we know, Laban has no relationship with God. There's not like he's pursuing God, like he regularly hears from God. He's going to talk about divination and some other wickedness in this text. So I think God literally shows up to a lost man and says, I know what's happening here, you better be careful, which is probably grace, but I think it's also done to protect Jacob. We got to know that. So one way or the other, Laban has ill intentions in mind, and God has warned him to be careful. Now, I would even go further and say I think he's too cheap of a man to throw a big party for his daughter's leaving, to be honest with you. He was a miser. He took advantage of people. He was always squeezing a nickel or a dime. So, and he's never shown any indication of affection toward his daughters up until this point in the text. So I don't think any of this is genuine. But he just rattles off all these things. And I think even as he rattles them off, he realizes everybody knows I'm just blowing smoke. And so he changes tactics. Verse 29, it is in my power to do you harm. But the God of your father spoke to me last night saying, be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. Laban is one of those people, he likes to make spiritual references. He probably thought this would sound good, dropping God into the conversation. I had a conversation with God, last night. But again, he's been guilty of divination in the past, or at least he's claimed to do so. What he's really saying is, I have you at sword point. And I hope you're aware of that. And if it was left up to me, I would probably do something about it. But your God showed up and warned me. I really believe that even in the way he handles this, he's really close to incurring the wrath of God. He's pushing it just a little bit. Because there's no doubt to me that he's trying to threaten Jacob, but he's admitting that he's being restrained by God. So really, he's doing what... he's kind of guilty of what God warned him about, in my opinion, the way I read it. So he brings out his last complaint, though, likely the one, in my opinion, that matters to him the most, and that is the theft. He says in verse 30, "And now you've gone away because you longed greatly for your father's house, but why did you steal my gods?" You may or may not remember that his daughter left his home with his household idols in her baggage. And so he brings that concern to the forefront. Maybe this is just strategy, but considering that they keep coming up in the chapter, I don't really think so. I think Laban, honestly, he swears by his household idols. I think they really mean something to him. And I think, of course, he's kind of confused. If you worship Jehovah God, why would you want these items that are important to me and these household idols that I treasure? But one way or the other, I think he's flaunting God's warning. I think he's nearing the edge of kind of the moral cliff here, and he's about to get himself in trouble. But let's consider these idols fairly. Let me read to you Genesis 31, 32 through 55 here in the text. 32 through 35. You're not going to have to listen through that many texts. He says this: "Anyone with whom you find your gods," this is Jacob's response to him, okay? "Anyone with whom you find your gods shall not live. In the presence of our kinsmen, point out what I have that is yours and take it." Now Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen them. So Laban went into Jacob's tent, and into Leah's tent, and into the tent of the two female servants, but he did not find them. And he went out to Leah's tent and entered Rachel's, or went out of Leah's tent and entered Rachel's. Now Rachel had taken the household gods and put them in the camel's saddle and sat on them. Laban felt all about the tent, but did not find them. And she said to her father, "Let not my lord be angry that I cannot rise before you, for the way of women is upon me." So he searched, but did not find the household gods. Now, we know and understand from the text that his household idols, they're there all along, but not where he expected them to be. I think for some reason, again, he assumes Jacob's the one who stole them, so he starts searching with his tent. And, of course, he winds up searching Leah's tent and so on, and Rachel's tent, and being honest, his menstruating daughter, or at least she claims that, is sitting on them all along the way. She's ridden about 300 miles seated on these idols, and now, again, they're still providing a resting place for her. I don't want to be crude, but if it is her time of the month, then it even makes the picture worse. I mean, I'm not trying to be crude. I'm just saying it like the text says it. She said to her father, "Let not my lord be angry that I cannot rise before you, for the way of women is upon me." So he searched but did not find the household gods. Jacob's God is the God of the heavens and the earth, the creator of the universe, the eternal God, the righteous judge, the giver and sustainer of life. He was the God who had turned all of Jacob's hardships and suffering into prosperity and blessing. He's leading his return to Canaan, even though Jacob kind of did it in a nefarious way. He's got all these children that are going to later make up the tribes of Israel, and he's got flocks and herds and wealth. And Laban's gods are sitting under a menstruating woman. I mean, that's just what the text is telling us. And so, I'm not saying anything about women or, that time of the month. That's not what I'm trying. I'm just saying that this is the predicament, so to speak, in which we're supposed to see Laban's gods. And here's the reality. In every culture, this would have rendered those gods unclean. Okay, ritually unclean, ceremonially unclean, however you want to say it. But I would argue, in any reasonable person's mind, it would also make them a little impotent. I mean, I'm fortunate that we love and serve and worship a God. I can't sit on him. I can't put him in my back pocket and carry him anywhere. I can't make him with my own hands. He's not been fashioned from some item I keep around the house. Jacob's God had come to Laban in a dream the night before and warned him to be careful of how he treats Jacob. And Laban's gods have been godnapped, you could say, and kept in saddlebags under a bloody dress. And they're not speaking on their own behalf because they cannot. And so it's kind of a good time just to ask the question, what do you want to worship in your own personal life? I mean, what are you looking for? Are you looking for a God you can make and fashion with your own hands, or do you want the timeless, eternal God who's given us the scriptures and so much more? And yet, as I read this passage, I'm struck by how deeply Laban loves and cares for these idols. He wants them. He misses them. They're on his mind in the middle of this confrontation. And I would argue, at its root and at its core, this is demonic. This is an individual who's deceived. He's deluded. He can no longer see the truth. And that's what we're seeing in Laban. And yet, I would argue in God's grace, I believe God allows Rachel's lie to succeed. She is being deceptive in this moment. And I don't think God is particularly, he doesn't want her to have these idols. God's not protecting her deception, don't get me wrong. But because if Laban had found his little statues or stones or sticks or whatever they were fashioned, I think he probably would have blown his top and somebody would have died, and this confrontation would have got out of hand. So, again, God is protecting Rachel. God is protecting Jacob. Rachel has not given birth yet to Benjamin, so I think her days are certainly not played out. But Laban is blind to all this. He's blind. He's ignorant. But enough of Laban for the moment. Let's turn to Jacob. Jacob, somewhere in the middle of this, I think he gets righteously angry again because he doesn't know that the idols are there. And it's taking place in front of everybody, including his wives and all that. And so he answered kind of the charges that Laban's been rendering, because I was afraid, for I thought that you would take your daughters from me by force. Now, he's going back to, why did you slip out under the cover of darkness? Why did you not let us have a big shindig? And I think he's being honest. I was afraid. I think you're a madman, and if you think of the situation that they're currently in, I think Laban is now rifling around through all their possessions. He's probably got his sword in hand. He's making veiled threats. He's growing more and more angry. I think Jacob's like, point proven. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, I had a good reason to slip out. Anybody would have done the same thing. And I think he's kind of reached the point. He's had about all he can handle of Laban and the double deals and all that. And in that sense, the past comes home to roost. We see the accusation here. Jacob became angry. And again, he's outnumbered. It's probably not a good time to lose your cool, but he does. He berated Laban. Jacob said to Laban, "What is my offense? What is my sin that you've hotly pursued me? For have you felt through all my goods? What have you found of all your household goods? Set it here before my kinsmen and your kinsmen, that they may decide between us two." Now, again, I think Jacob needs to be very careful taking the moral high ground, what we know of him at this point, but that's kind of what he's doing. You think you're right. You've looked through everything. You've threatened me. Maybe you've lied about this theft to intimidate. Let's let all these witnesses gathered here render judgment on whether or not I've committed any crime. That's really what he's saying. And I don't think we can blame him for saying it, but he probably needs to be careful, because Laban is about no telling what Laban is apt to do, and which is, again, I think why God, in a very unusual manner, you can't find many times in Scripture when God visits a lost person and speaks to them. He's done so with Laban, and I think that's to keep Laban from cutting Jacob's neck off at this point. But anyway, we move on. The accusation, we come to the aggression. Jacob is, basically kind of throwing it back in his face. Listen to verses 38 through 42 here. Again, I'm in that weird spot where I don't know if I need my glasses or not. I need more light's what I need. But 38, these 20 years I've been with you, your ewes and your female goats have not miscarried, and I've not eaten the rams of your flocks. What was torn by wild beasts I did not bring to you. I bore the loss of it myself. From my hand you required it, whether stolen by day or stolen by night. There I was. By day the heat consumed me, and the cold by night, and my sleep fled from my eyes. These 20 years I've been in your house. I served you 14 years for your 2 daughters, 6 years for your flock. You've changed my ways wages 10 times. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had not been on my side, surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed. God saw my affliction and the labor of my hands and rebuked you last night. Well, he's definitely taking the moral high ground. And yet, when we read that, and I don't think we have any reason to question Jacob's account of things in general, it does seem pretty clear that he dealt honestly with Laban. He had an angle, but he did what he said he was going to do. Laban hadn't found anything in the camp that belongs to him. Even Laban's daughters, they're actually Jacob's wives, right? Can we be honest? When you get married, you're supposed to leave and cleave. And so they're way more Jacob's possession than they are their daddy's by anyone's version of reality, okay? And speaking of that, by the way, Jacob had only intended to marry one of them. Who wound up making sure he was married to both the daughters? Laban, okay? I'm just being honest about the text. He's the one who kept changing the deal, and then he did the same thing with the sheep every time, and we don't have to go back through all that, but he kept wanting to change the deal so that he would get the better of it, and I think God continually intervened, and Jacob always came across winning, so to speak. And so that's kind of where we find ourselves. And I think we should all know why this has happened, and even Laban should. The God of my fathers, Jacob says, the God of Abraham, the fear of Isaac, if he had not been on my side, surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed. I don't think that's crazy. God saw my affliction and the labor of my hands and rebuked you last night. Now, until Laban had mentioned it, Jacob hadn't known about Laban's dream and God speaking to him. But I think now, he's starting to get pretty confident. The past has proven God's got his back, and then this scenario kind of proves God's got his back, and it's all tied up in a neat little bow, and even to the point, I think, where he knows that Laban is having to throttle down his anger. He's having to control himself because he doesn't want to get crossways with God. And again, I think we kind of have to take a step back and say, man, God is really, really good, even though Jacob, he's still the deceiver at this point. Anybody in here ever been at the point in your life where God took really good care of you and you really didn't deserve it? Now, I'm not speaking of just general grace and mercy, but you were an absolute knucklehead, and yet you flourished in that moment. Okay, and this is where, people with poor theology and broken theology, they act like, if you do good, you get rewarded, and if you do bad, you get judged. Prosperity doctrine's quick to say that. No, my point is that sometimes there are believers who are living in rebellion who do not suffer the consequences as they should. How you're blessed or not blessed doesn't tell me whether or not you're living in intimacy with God. That's not a good measure of God. God sees the heart. None of us are capable of that. So, prosperous or not, I don't know. We have to spend time with somebody. We have to see the fruit of their labors. And whether or not you're winning at work or whatever it may be doesn't necessarily tell me anything. But one way or the other, everyone here, I think, is getting a clear reminder of the goodness of God. And Jacob, too. The one who's later to become Israel, be named that. Of course, Laban is here listening and getting a lesson too, and I think he's pretty speechless. Maybe not speechless, but he's spent all of his bullets. He knows he doesn't have a leg to stand on, but he still has his pride to protect. And when you take a step back, you just think, isn't this how so many people respond to the gospel when they see God clearly? You can lean into what you're seeing, and you can realize that God is big and God has made a way for us, and he protects even those who probably, Jacob is no knight in shining armor, but it's clear that the affection and the love of God has been on his life. Laban could have leaned into all this and realized, I want to have a relationship with this God, who's so good to protect a knucklehead like you. Tell me about this God. But he doesn't do that. He immediately just wants to turn from the truth here, and he kind of wants to act like he's morally superior again, but he wants to do no business with God. And so I think that's what we see here, and we better bring it to a conclusion. But we come to the conflict resolution, and I do believe Laban's pride is really driving all this. It's an ugly situation, but his pride won't quite let it go. I do think, he keeps wanting to reestablish superiority over Jacob and even imply the equality of his gods here to Jacob's God. He keeps doing that. But I do think there's a simple principle here, by the way. Sometimes when you're in a family, you're never going to see everything just exactly the same way. This would probably be true being part of a church too. Sometimes you just have to find a way to make peace. To live, to get along, and to move forward. Again, it doesn't mean you have to suspend your beliefs, so that's not what I'm saying. But you know what? This Laban is the father of Jacob's 2 wives. He is the grandfather of these children. And it doesn't do anybody any good for this to be an ugly parting. And that's kind of what we see. I think Jacob goes along with Laban's bluster just to make this work. And I think a healthy fear of God probably helps a little bit as well. But we see a compromise here, verses 43 and 44. Laban answered and said to Jacob, and again, this is where I really want to punch Laban in the teeth at this point, but just listen to what. The daughters are my daughters, the children are my children, the flocks are my flocks, and all that you see is mine. Now, that sounds really arrogant, doesn't it? But what can I do this day for these my daughters or for their children whom they have borne? Come now, let us make a covenant, you and I, and let it be a witness between you and me. Again, Laban is taking over the situation, and to me, this just he's a jerk. Okay, can I say it that bluntly? After everything that's happening, he wants to reestablish, it all started with me. Everything you've got is mine. But I'm going to be the bigger man. And let's cut a covenant here and let's go in peace. It's just, I could poke more holes in it, but I won't do that. I can picture Rachel perhaps, laughing at him while she repositions her rear on his gods. But anyway, I'll leave it at that. That's just my flesh talking. That's not in Scripture. But you're not human if you don't get this a little bit. And it only gets worse. We come to the covenant here. So Jacob took a stone and set it up as a pillar. And Jacob said to his kinsmen, gather stones. And they took stones, made a heap, and they ate there by the heap. Now, this is where we don't get Old Testament covenant and pillars and stones and all that. We don't really have a place for that in our worship and New Testament era. But this was all very familiar to them, cutting covenant, whether you were a follower of God or not. That was very typical in lots of cultures, swearing promises, so to speak. We've talked about even the blood brother culture that remained with the Native Americans. That's existed for generations or centuries, however long you want to say. But I think in this specific instance, when Jacob does this, I believe we're supposed to think immediately back to Genesis 28 and what he did when he left home and he headed to Haran. He has a past with God, and it's really close to this location. And I'm referring to Jacob's ladder. Most of us know it that way. But back in Genesis 28, so early in the morning, Jacob took the stone that he put under his head and set it up for a pillar and poured oil on the top of it. He had this encounter with God, which I believe one of the best typological pictures of salvation and the gospel in the Old Testament, Jacob's ladder and all that. He had that encounter. He went on after setting those stones up, and he named that place Bethel, or City of God. And he vowed that if God would provide for him, then he's going to follow God and worship him. And he even swears a tithe to him and all those things. And I have to believe when he takes this stone in verse 45, he at least remembers what he did. It's been 20 years, but it's got to be on his mind. It's bringing him full circle. Here he is coming back to the land of his forefathers and the God of the covenant. And now he is, building another pillar, you might say. It's not an altar, but a pillar. And so in returning to Canaan, I think he's being made aware that every promise that God had made for him has been fulfilled in the past. And it's being fulfilled in the future for him. Now, old Laban, though, unfortunately is here, and he has to corrupt the whole proceeding, in my opinion. He's not really interested in cutting a covenant. He wants a peace treaty. I hate to be political, but I will be. He sounds a lot like Iran or Russia or the UN. He doesn't really want a peace treaty. He just has a point he wants to make. Genesis 31, 47 through 53. Let's listen to that for a second. Laban called it Jagar Shedadutha, but Jacob called it Gilead. They're going to argue about the naming of this thing. Laban said, "This heap is a witness between you and me today." Therefore, he named it Gilead and Mizpah, for he said, "The Lord watch between me, or you and me, when we're out of one another's sight. If you oppress my daughters, or if you take wives beside my daughters, although no one is with us, see, God is witness between you and me." Then Laban said to Jacob, "See this heap and this pillar which I've set up between you and me. This heap is a witness, and the pillar is a witness that I'll not pass over this heap to you, and you'll not pass over this heap and this pillar to me to do me harm. The God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judge between us." So Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac. Now, just a few interesting things here that I think is kind of easy to miss. But in the covenant process, in general, there has to be two of everything. Each party contributes a portion, so to speak. So Jacob has his stone here. Again, permit my way of framing this. Laban has his pile of stones. It's the pillar, you could say, versus the pile. Because one man sees the spiritual significance of this. He's building a pillar like he did when he first came out of Canaan. The other man just has a pile of rocks, kind of like his gods. But anyway, one is symbolic of Jehovah God, one symbolic of the gods of Laban. And of course, it's always convenient that if you worship the stones, you can just dig up more anytime you need them, you know. But the text seems to demand we look at this way, though. The pillar and the pile. Laban and Jacob even have different names for the pillar and the pile. Laban wants to use an Aramean phrase while Jacob is speaking in Hebrew. So you have different names for the location. And then I think there's kind of the point of the whole process that they're going to argue over. Laban invokes these stones as witnesses, somehow enforcing a treaty between the two men, swearing that Jacob won't mistreat his daughters. Well, to this point, Jacob's pretty much been a yes sir, yes no, yes ma'am, no ma'am kind of guy. If you remember, they pretty much tell him what to do and where to go and who to sleep with, and he does it. I don't think he's not mistreated them. He's been bossed, if I'm being honest about it. So anyway, Laban's the one who's mistreated his daughters. But he even implies that there needs to be a swearing that Jacob won't pass that point with any intention to harm Laban. Come on. Jacob's not going to take up his sword and go after Laban and go back to Haran. It's not going to happen, okay? It's just not going to happen. He's not the one who rode in here with a bunch of men. He's not been hateful, all that stuff, been on revenge. He's not the one who probably would have killed the other had God not showed up in a dream and sworn him to be nice, okay? So the whole situation it sticks in my craw, so to speak, because Laban is coming across like a self-righteous little hypocrite, trying to keep the upper hand and lecture Jacob about his intentions. And all the while, it's been Laban's heart to be wicked and evil. Anyway, kind of like our culture, though, if we're being honest about it. It's amazing the people who now take the moral high ground in our nation. I'm not going to go further than that, but if you're not following me, you don't need to. But it's astonishing where we've come from. Anyway, but I'll say this. Before you lecture Christianity or the church or anybody else about how we behave or try to nitpick our failures, you probably need to always consider your own heart. That's a good place to start. Again, we don't see Laban ever doing this. But also, if we're being honest, Jacob doesn't need a witness. Jacob doesn't need a marker or a pillar or a pile of stones because he has something much greater. He has a personal relationship with Jehovah God. That's enough. And that God is still with him and was always going to be with him. God had sworn a covenant to him to do that. And we've seen that illustrated in his past. Even when Jacob wasn't pursuing God, God never abandoned him. It's a beautiful thing. And Laban here, though, he even has the audacity to try to level the playing field between the gods in his last statement. Listen to verse 53. The God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judge between us. Now, we know the God of Abraham, that's Jehovah God. But the God of Nahor, the God of their father, he's talking about himself, Laban, my God. There is no such God. You know, you're invoking a deity that doesn't exist. Well, I mean, if it does, it's sitting under Rachel's roof. Anyways, anybody? I hope you follow me on this, okay? That's what's happening here. And so Jacob does, though, he finishes this little conflict resolution by taking the high road. And this is, I think, when it's family, you can pull this off. So Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac. You know, he's not invoking some name of some false god. He's going to swear by his God. Jacob offered a sacrifice in the hill country, called his kinsmen to eat bread. They ate bread, spent the night in the hill country. Early in the morning, Laban arose, kissed his grandchildren and his daughters, and blessed them. Then Laban departed and returned home. To me, Jacob is looking more and more like Abraham and Isaac in this text, and less like Laban. He swears by the God of his father, Isaac, who Laban has failed to name. It's a bit of a new way of rendering God's name that he introduces here, but invokes certainly the idea of God causing the fear of his father. God is worthy of our fear, and you know, in a righteous sort of reverence, I believe. He's really the only one worthy of fear or respect or allegiance, because he is big and he is real and he is living and he is holy. He is fearful, and yet he's personal, and Jacob is experiencing all of that. And so he has no problem sealing this truce and this covenant, and he swears by his God. I don't think he ever intended to not complete the covenant, but he displays his faith here in every little action. Laban's doing all the talking, but look who's doing the sacrificing. Jacob brings an animal forward. He sacrifices. And so he's contributing to something in this process. I would argue the lamb for the covenant process is what Jacob provides. It's his animal that dies, and even the food that they share is his. It says he calls his kinsmen to eat bread. He is following the covenant-keeping process, or the covenant-cutting process, that Abraham first experienced. If you go back to that, it's just been 2 generations. And so, in so many ways, I think he's able to leave Haran with the moral high ground, which is saying a lot for Jacob, if we're being honest. But his journey should be a reminder here that God provides for us even when we're knuckleheads, even when we're not really pursuing God, even when we're not thinking about God as we should. Even in adversity, God is with us. And so I'll just tell you this, if Jacob can come out smelling like a rose at this point, we've all got a chance. Amen? I hope that's one thing you can draw from this, and I hope we'll willfully turn to God and worship Him. It reminds me, and I think this is a very fitting way to conclude. If you're here for our pastor-led revival last fall, we looked at Romans 8, and I think these verses really apply to God's grace in our lives and how He's treated Jacob all through this text. Listen to verses 28 through 32 in Romans 8. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to His purpose. For those whom He foreknew, He also predestined to be conformed to the image of His Son, in order that He might be the firstborn among many brothers. And those whom He predestined, He also called. And those whom He called, He also justified. And those whom He justified, He also glorified. What then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare His own Son, but gave Him up for us all, how will He not also with Him graciously give us all things? Doesn't mean everything you do is approved because you're a child of God. Doesn't mean everything Jacob did over those 20 years was right. Doesn't mean, that's not what it's saying. But it's saying if you love God and you follow God and you have a relationship with God, you can count on God always working things out for His glory and for your good, even when you've done something nefarious and ticked off your father-in-law and he pursues you with a bunch of armed men. And even then, God is making a way, and that's what we see in this text. And so we'll stop there, and next week we'll pick it up. Let's just say Jacob's going to go from one armed confrontation. He's lurching toward another one because his big brother Esau is waiting on him as he nears Canaan. Anyway, thank you all for coming, and we'll see you again next week.